I'm Kat Nelson. I'm the deputy editor at Time Out Beijing. There's a couple copies actually out by the door if you guys didn't see them. And this month's issue was about literature. So hopefully that's interesting. It was the best China books. And also, if you don't get enough in the next hour, there's a really nice interview with Xiaolu Guo in that issue as well. So yeah, let me introduce Xiaolu Guo. And she's originally from a fishing village in Zhejiang province, but for the past decade plus has been living abroad in Europe and currently is in London. So her background is as a filmmaker, which some of you may know her work, and now she's mostly writing primarily. And this is her first book in English. She's written a number of novels in Chinese, but has now been writing in English. And so her first book was a concise Chinese-English dictionary for lovers, and her latest novel is I Am China, which is what we'll be mostly speaking about today, although touching on some other things as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Xiaolu right now, and she can introduce herself a bit more, and also maybe start by doing a small reading excerpt from her first novel in English.
First or last?
First or last? Whichever.
Thanks for being here, and I'm really happy to see many very young people, teenagers. So I don't read the sexual part. I will a bit more healthy, so yeah, I have social responsibility. But it's good, you know, I'm so-called 100% of Chinese, but I left China when I was 29 or nearly 30 years old. I went to Europe, first in London, then I lived in Paris for a year and a half to try to write my films, make my film with French. And then I moved to Berlin and Hamburg for nearly 2 years. And I couldn't understand the German, but you know, I don't think I can really go further beyond that. And then I moved back to London. So in a way, you know, although my so-called identity, my traditional identity is Chinese, but my cultural identity is really a construction of European literature and European cinema. And in a way, I always joke about, you know, the influence. Like for me, you know, like Margaret Duras or Italo Calvino is more important than Lu Xun to me in a way. And also, I remember when I was a teenager, the first impact when I first discovered French beat poets. For example, you're not Allen Ginsberg or Kerouac, but someone like Charles Bukowski, I loved so much when I was a teenager in a little village in the south, in Zhejiang province. I wanted to mention all this because I think it's quick, you can identify me very quickly. So without going through, so what did you read, you know, how did you write? Because I think once I mention those authors, which made a big influence in my life, I think you more or less get my number, you know, okay, she's contractual from that. And because I'm not a very old writer yet, so you can see, you know, I think so far I wrote about 11 books, but 8 books are in Chinese when I was in China before I was 30 years old. I published those Chinese books, mainly a theory book. So I was some boring academic, critical, you know, art critics when I was in China. I was writing for some magazines, you know, film critics, essays, and I had this essay column called "Lucy in the Sky Without Diamond." So I was very busy when I was in China, and I wrote the theory books and 3 novels and others collection of short story. And on the day, you know, I nearly was 30 years old, I left China to London. And I think in London, the first 3 years was really a depression, was really bad depression for me. And I wanted to move out. And that was the time I moved to Paris to live, study French, speak French. I think that is, you know, that was the time I tried to reinvent myself as an artist. I remember when I arrived to London, I said, well, it's inconsistent if I write in Chinese again in London, which no one gives a damn if you're Chinese. You know, in France, it's a bit better. There's more like literature, intellectual Chinese community in France, or even in Berlin, you know, and in America, in New York, there's a few Chinese writers in New York. And even in Canada, like Toronto, there's quite cultured Chinese community. But in London, it's just post-colonial depression, from Asia, and I'm amongst Bangladeshi immigrants, who, they contain this kind of a post-colonial problem. But anyway, so I said that I wanted to continue to live as an artist, as a writer and a filmmaker. So the only solution is I'm going to use this language, which I never studied. I never went to school studying English. So I'm going to use that language to begin my life in the West. And also when I left China, I was all hungry and angry with the culture. Because you can already tell, I'm very kind of spiky character, you can tell I'm not very good in the school and has all the problem with institution. So I wasn't happy when I was in Beijing. And so in London I began to write in English. And I never went to school study English or never speak one word of English before. It's very limited. Like I have book, do you? Those kind of things. And and I realized that point you change your identity from a Chinese writer to not a British writer, not English writer, but the writer who try to use second language to convey your new experience, and you really began to reinvent yourself. And I think that was the moment I started to find myself again. But that was like 5 years later. So I wrote that book, A Concise Chinese English Dictionary for Lovers, and that's 13 years ago. And after that, I just began to write in English. After that, I wrote another, I think, 4 or 5 books in English. But each time is painful struggle, because I come from a very traditional Chinese background. My parents are hardcore communists from South, and I grew up in this just typical kind of Chinese school. So this reinvention of identity, which is, I think it's creative, but of course, it's miserable as well to refine your language as a writer. And I remember at one point I was reading a lot of Milan Kundera, because Milan Kundera used to write in Czech when he lived in Czechoslovakia. And he left Czech and he left the Communist Party. He went to live in France and he writes in French only now. And he's a French citizen, he's not dual nationality. And I think reading Milan Kundera was, a sort of kind of my kind of solace, my kind of comfort. A man reinvent himself in France as a writer, and equally political, but he would refuse to talk about his identity because he believes a great artist is living beyond identity. So, well, that's my beginning silly speech.
I think it would actually be really nice to hear a bit from A Concise Chinese English Dictionary for Lovers, because it's told from the point of view of a woman who has moved, a Chinese woman who has moved to London and is coming to grasp with the English language. So I think that would provide a nice context. I'm not sure how many people in the audience are familiar with the novel, but
I guess I mean this was the first novel I came to London and wrote. But I was kind of an older writer then, because I did publish like 8 or 9 books in Chinese. So with this novel, now when I look at the first novel I wrote in London, and sometimes I feel a certain kind of shame in a way, because I could no longer write in such a naked way, talking about love and longing and loneliness. And I think there's a certain kind of ageness in me, or there's a certain kind of not self-censorship. There's a certain kind of self-consciousness in me as a writer or as an artist. I'm no longer really free to write my film or write my novels. And this novel is so naked. Like I just feel this nakedness throughout the book when I'm reading now after 13 years. And I wanted to say. A Concise Chinese English Dictionary for Lovers was, it's also a stolen idea. All the writers are a good thief. So if you want to write a book, steal ideas, quickly from all the inspiration you had. And I remember I was reading Roland Barthes' book called A Lover's Discourse, and in Chinese translation it's 恋人絮. And it's a wonderful book. So I got this idea of. He analyzed the conversation between 2 lovers, but he analyzed in French. And, linguistically it's an extremely important book, but also psychology, how he reveals the truth when the lovers say "I love you," but which means "I hate you." Can you go away? You know, something like the message beyond the language and the undertones. And I got this idea from that book, so I thought I would just write a book, you know, with broken English, which was my English, and still I'm speaking very broken English. But I will use that as a strength of my novel, and I would use purely vocabulary. So this novel is like 99 vocabularies or something like that. And because I could never write a story, and storytelling is my enemy in a way. And I am a writer who doesn't like storytelling. I am a writer who loves ideas and visions or philosophical discourse. So whenever there comes a story development, I say, shit, I don't know what to do now. Okay, I put a lover in, you know. Well, love is only the answer. And then, I put some kind of, you know, death. You know, that's another answer. Because you would understand me if you write novels. What sustain your book is, you know, the certain development, you know, whether dramatically or emotionally. And I was never trained to write dramatically. You know, so far, you know, all my readings are kind of philosophy book. So this novel, you will find, you know, there's not much a story, but it's just a man and a woman having this kind of war on culture and on love. And of course, it's very, you know, autobiography. And originally, the man is a gay character, so he's a bisexual, but really homosexual character. And the novel is about this peasant Chinese woman's battle with that lover, who is a hippie English bisexual, who, you know, she was identity in order to fit into her identity. And I think for me, I was very much kind of influenced by, you know, something like Margaret Duras. You know, she always thought, you know, love is a battle, is a war. And I think I'm always that kind of war maker person, you know, always try to shape the war in my life and outside of my life. And I think that's why I'm choosing living in exile, although no one forced me to be exiled. Anyway, just to start with, so the novel written in the broken English to begin with, and then later on, the characters start to speak better English, supposed to be very good English. But it took me a very long time to write the last 10 pages, because it's supposed to be perfect English. And 13 years ago, I barely speak a sentence. So I had to wait for about 2 years just to finish the last chapter. And then I began to really read proper English. But then it was never, you know, like Victoria literature. So I was just reading English from really B generation, Jack Kerouac, those more like modern American English. Try to give myself a kind of, you know, education. I'm just going to read you a little section from the later part of the novel. So you know, because I play the language trick. In Chinese language, there's no tense difference, so there's no verb change, and there's no gender difference. Wait, hey, that's a big deal. So we don't have she or he, she does, or we do. You know, everything is one tense and one gender. And especially in German language, you know, the table has a gender, the book is male or female, and the flowers could be male, the chair is neutral. So in German there's a four gender, and then, you know, in Chinese we had one. So I play with those linguistic difference in this book. And in this section I start to use past tense. As you know, for Chinese, the most difficult thing is to write in past progressive tense. What a shit concept, past progressive. And I wrote this book, you know, like the first 200 pages was, you know, present tense. As a Chinese language, pure present tense, yeah? And that was really very difficult to understand. That you need to use, I had been doing something, but I didn't finish it. In Chinese, it doesn't exist, this kind of tense. So, anyway, so the novel was playing with those tense and playing with the idea of love, which, you know, this is kind of cliche, you know, love is loveless in the Chinese tense. But in the English tense, love is always conditioned with time. And so I play from beginning to the end. And so this section is called Possess. As you know, because I couldn't write a real narrative, so I just use, you know, a little narrative per page, and that's all I can get. And next page you will get another vocabulary and get another fragment of their love story. So possess, it's a noun. It means to have as one's property, or it means of a feeling, a belief, or it means have complete control of something, or it means to dominate, possess. You told me my love to you is like a possession, but how could I possess you when you are impossible to possess? Maybe it's not about possession, but it's more about me trying to fit into your life. I am living in your life, and I'm living inside of your body. I'm trying to understand every single movement from your command. Every night, I inhale and exhale your breath. Every night, the smells from your hair and your skin cover my hair and my skin. I know nobody in my life is as close as you. I just hope the night will continue and carry on like this, to go on forever. I hope our bodies can be always close like this, and our souls always can be side by side. I don't want the sun to come and the day to arrive. I know the light of the day takes over, or it will take away from you. And then you live in your own world, and the world that has a big gap between us. But in the daytime, you only stay with your sculptures, with your clays, your sand, your wax, your water, and you're making many molds of the human bodies, your sculpture. You love them. All the materials, they lie there, quiet, with vague and unclear meaning. And there's a conversation on the bed after we make love. It goes like this. But why you are always so interested in the body, can you tell me? And the man answers, because you will never get bored with the body. Then you rub the sperm on my skin slowly and then trying to dry it. And you say, eating, drinking, shitting, these things are essential. The body is the key to everything. But then I say, but why your sculpture is so ugly and miserable? And you say, well, I don't think they're ugly, they're beautiful. I say, well, yes, maybe to you. They're beautiful in the most ugly way. And they are always your kind of manifestation. Well, but that's what life is like, you say. I can't agree, but I cannot deny either. And you say, my body always feels miserable, except for when I'm making love. Your voice becomes sleepy, and then you close your eyes. Now I turn off the light, I stare at the darkness. I have enough thoughts to talk to the long, dark night, alone, absolutely alone. So that was a novel I wrote when I was extremely low and lonely in London when I left China. And I remember I kept the diary every day, you know, with those vocabularies I learned every day in London. And I tried to find a way to fit in those vocabularies in a narrative format. And then later on, when I published this novel, and I look back at that diary, it was very, very close. Because the diary was constructed, you know, every day with like 2 or 3 new words I would learn. And then sometimes I would learn, you know, a bit more fancy vocabulary, like sensational, you know, or you know, or some idea like, it's more like a, you know, intellectual vocabulary I learned later on, and I found they are quite narrative. And this is really, you know, this novel came about very fragmented. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I think if we fast forward 13 years to now your latest book, so to I Am China, I mean, you still see a lot of similarities in that it's highly intellectual and packed with ideas. It's not, you know, the sort of, I guess, typical young Chinese woman writer who's writing a memoir in English. You're dealing with much more existential ideas, and I'm not sure how many people have been able to read I Am China, because I know it's a bit in limited supply, so maybe it makes sense to give a short synopsis and then give a bit of background about the book and its sort of emergence.
So I Am China is quite new, so I don't think, you know, any of you read this, and it's just published and it's just translated in Europe. Because I was very much, I think as a writer I'm ambitious, but not in the, you know, in the content. I'm ambitious with the style, with, you know, how you exercise the literature format. So I'm bored with, like one type of narrative from A to Z, from, this kind of perspective, God's perspective. He came in, he told me his mother is sick and he's going to get married, and that kind of narrative. I don't really believe in that kind of narrative anymore. And I was always a fan of French literature, of course, Natalia Xiaolu, French New Wave, and I think Oulipo group, and of course Calvino is always very important to me. I think my literature identity is really kind of European one, and I believe in multi-point of view, and I believe in the thoughts is totally fragmented. So when you try to tell a story, there's another story going on behind your back, and then they hijack your current story, and then there's a kind of disturbance from you or your mother or your uncle come in, and then take over the storytelling. So the story becomes totally elusive and complex. And that also demonstrates the human psyche is so mysterious. Human psyche is never a linear one. And I think that explains my boredom or ennui or impatience when I read a very traditional book. Sometimes I fall asleep in the page 2 or sentence 2. I think because this insatisfaction in me demand a kind of a new voice or new type of narrative, although there's nothing new, after David Bowie there's nothing new, after Andy Warhol, everything's old, but still there's a certain kind of drive to be new, it's nearly like a perpetual revolution. You try to make a novel with a unique voice, with certain structure which echoes with humanity, which is totally not coherent and narrative based. It's impulsive and chaotic, and I think that's really quite honest writing. Honest, maybe in the experimental way, but in a more, the human psyche is a chaotic one. So then there's a novel called I Am China, which is clear. I would write from 3 points of view, So this book originally was, I am a man. I'm a male, male punk, exiled in China. Left China, come to Europe, and it's about his own journey left alone, abandoned by the political struggle, because he believed in political struggle, and he's kind of post-Marxist, which I am still, although I'm living in London, the most commercial place in the whole world. But anyway, I wanted to write that character who really believed in the political struggle, but forever been abandoned by his country, China. And I tried to refine his identity in Europe, but he couldn't. So originally I thought, okay, this will be male novel. I'm going to use a different pen name, because I'm longing or dying to write a book which is totally male and hard. But for the narrative purpose, it doesn't work, because I realize it's pure monologue without other characters. Then you invent, love and death, of course. So you have 2 women characters, and you have other characters, and you have English characters, and you have all these temporary characters, because the book is about on a journey in the US and in Europe. Then have to invent those little, there's American characters, lovers, French lovers or Swiss problems, all this stuff, which is easy. But then there's a thinking: how do I shape this novel with all this multi-voice? And then I found a way. This novel is about the 2 lovers try to send each other letters and write each other emails. But it's all about this 20 years, the separation between them from China to the West. And then another question before I write this novel. Well, that sounds very odd. Normally you don't think so much things before you write. But this is a novel. It's a pure conspiracy for me, because I have been writing all my books very primitively, which means I write my book with my feet, which means I don't think intellectually before I write a story. But with this novel, I Am China, it was clear I wanted to do a novel which multi-perspective, which contains China, America, and Europe. And I wanted to write a novel about the discussion between politics and art, and the living in exile. So those themes bothered me for the last 13 years when I lived in the West. So I have to cook that theme in a more organic way, which demanded me to make a structure before I even write a story. So this is very anti-literature class. If you do the educational literature, you wouldn't have character and emotion first. Because the emotions in me, for years I know what I'm writing. And the characters I know, this punk character is me, it's head on against the reality. And that is always there. But I was trying to construct those multi-narrative layers before I began the book. And then the last question I had, why do I write in English? If I lived in France long enough, I would write in French too. But why this book I have to write in English? Since I came back to China every 3-4 months, So this is a very big identity problem to write in English. And then I have to find a literature reason. I do live in London now, and it's my home. But I said, well, I have to have an English translator in this book as an author or as a reader to take you into this story. And then that's the reason I really write this book in English. So all the letters and diaries from these two lovers, they write to each other in Chinese. And then you have this young woman in Britain living in London, a white character, who desperately tried to translate those love letters and diaries. So that was the beginning of the whole writing. Then I began 5 years ago. So I started from a very unfamiliar character, which is an English woman who is young, have total freedom, apolitical, have all the sexual encounters, which my life is a bit boring. And I started from there, and then I discovered it's really difficult to write outside of you, right? Or instead of inside of you. And then I write this character who is a male punk, which I read all the the punk musicians' biography, Johnny Rotten or Bob Dylan, whoever I like, Joy Division or whatever, try to get a sense of male speaking in the rock and roll world, and that was also not really my vocabulary. And so that's why this novel took me like 4 or 5 years. Normally I'm a very quick, impatient writer. I finish a novel every year, and I no longer will revise because my heart has moved on. I abandon the book, and with this book I kept returning, revise, and then they become quite a difficult book to read. So you will find out it's not a straightforward book. Now I'm just going to read a little bit. And after that, you're going to take over, so I don't do monologue. So the book is set in everywhere, of course. The center point is London, but it's really about these two lovers separated after 1989. And they were really political activists in Beijing, in university. And they believe in politics and how the art should engage with politics. But then in the last 20 years, and their beliefs changed. So the man becomes martyr, and the woman becomes more like, not Buddhist, but more, in a way, wiser. And she believes in, life is bigger than art. And she believes in ideological struggle is very temporary, trivial even, for humanity. So, and it's about their argument. Once again, the lovers are the enemies. And I wanted to read this final letter the man sent to the woman. And after that, they separated totally. And every single letter and the diary I read or I wrote is being translated by this English translator. So that's the way I play with language. I thought, that's my weakness of writing in English, but also could be my strength writing in English. Why I use this kind of weird language, a bit Chinese style English. Anyway, so here's a narrative from the man to the woman. Dearest Moo, we both know that there's been nothing, no words between us for the last few months. I don't know where to write to you, so here's my last letter to our Beijing address. Whatever you read or not, it's me being foolish, perhaps, breaking through the silence, and no doubt that's what you will think. Right now, where am I? I've just left Paris, and now I'm on a train towards the south of France. Paris was a strange place. The fancy things around the River Seine doesn't do anything for me. Even those white blonde women, they were just too fancy for a third-world man like me. And I have finally made some contacts in Marseille, so maybe I could be a sailor after all, living on the blue sea rather than on the dirty land. I feel like I've been drifting up and down this European landscape over the last couple of months, like a cockroach running on the dirt. But Europe is a grim continent, and I think everything starts from Europe, from themselves and from their land. Often you will encounter some lonely cluster of stony homes in the middle of the countryside, and there will be a woman doing some housework in their garden, and there will be television glowing inside, and the trees glimpse through telegraph poles, and the murmurs of leaves the only sound. I picture myself living in those houses like these, with that kind of life. But is it a life? For me, it's not life, it's dead, like the bottom of a well. If I were Woody Guthrie, I would sing a song like this. This land is not my land, and this land is not for you or for me. No, China is not here. You are not here. And my manifesto, meaning nothing in this land and to these European people. 乡愁, nostalgia, that's the only emotion I have. I miss my land. There's no reason for me to put down my roots here, and there's no familiar earth under my feet. My roots have dried up and are broken off. But the sunlight, too, feels remote, as if I'm moving far away from the source of the sun, as if the sun is trying to escape from me. The sun doesn't recognize me anymore. My body is numb. It limps along like a strange looping animal, stiff, joints cracking, a cold-blooded blizzard. I'm a yesterday's man in the ragged but once fashionable clothes. That's how I feel on this train. I'm no longer a soldier, and there's no one waiting for me at the end of my destination. The train will spew me out, like a cat pukes up a hairball. And where then I'm heading to? Just the wind waiting to roll me and along some small town high street. But every now and then, just for a second, I think I am in China. And it chills me and warms me at the same time. My country looms heavy, bigger even than my mind. But sometimes it's small too, like a point in memory. Each time I see a brown wheat field or expanse of standing corn, I think of these intense yellow rapeseed flowers in the Hubei plains I love, and those wrinkle-faced peasants, shovels on their shoulders, walking like statues in the dirt, with glass-eyed buffaloes following. Then the streets and their life appear in my mind, the smells and tastes, the sesame oil from hidden jars, the laughter of fighting kids, bicycle bells, even the deafening fireworks of the Spring Festival. These images and the sounds flow like a river, whose mirror surface shimmers with sadness. And you, my woman, far away, maybe you are beyond this crying and laughing. Now, my last words to you in this letter. Whatever happens with your life and my life, I still have this love for you. So now I give it to you, wherever you are. Yours, Jan. Anyway, this letter I wrote from this male point of view, it's strange because I had those letters written before I had this book. And so those letters, some are from my diary and some are just purely fictional. I know will be the base of this book. And then later on, I was labored on this book, try to fit into those letters, to find a structure to put in those letters. And it's really like a literature exercise. You have those pockets being designed. You have the trivial stuff in your pocket, but you don't have this close yet. And I think it took me some years to find the structure and really the mode of narrative to fit into those small letters and diaries and fragments. So you asked me, was it fun to write? I said, well, it was fun, but it's very painful as well, because it's very personal. And I went beyond that, I went for some years, like, really troubled with my identity as an artist, and not able to really live the way I wanted to live. And then that time passed. Now, I kind of really found my structure in the West. And now it's kind of better, So yeah, I mean, I promise you, the novel is not only this sorrowful soul, there's also funny and ridiculous bits too.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the title of the book, which is very striking, I Am China, and it comes out of well, I guess the protagonist, but the punk rocker's manifesto that he drops and ultimately gets him ejected out of the country.
Yeah. So the title is a bit confusing, I Am China. It's nothing to do with Xiaolu Guo, of course. Because I do a lot of talk in Germany, Switzerland, France, you know, and so I say the title can be easily called I'm Germany, I'm USA, I'm Japan, I'm all this powerful country, because the book is about how the state take over the individual's identity. So rather than you are China, we are China, but the state is China. So it was never a citizen or individual. So it's about this male character, the punk character, who really lived so ideologically that he no longer lived for himself. And therefore he was totally lost in the story. But then the woman character who's kind of lived beyond the ideological problem, and she found herself. But then this is really my homage to Beat Generation and Allen Ginsberg, because you know, when you were young, you know, when you're in the Chinese village, there's not much books to read, you know, from the West. And of course, you know, my first influence is really American 60s poems, you know, like Frank O'Hara, for example, Sylvia Plath, Allen Ginsberg, you know, and then Charles Bukowski. I always loved Charles Bukowski immensely. But one of the Allen Ginsberg poem called America is so famous, and you know this poem. He wrote in 1956. And I used this poem in my book, and I returned to this poem a lot. So this poem is, you know, it's called America. I give you nothing. American $27. 7 cents, 1956. So what I did is I changed this word America just into China, and the whole poem suddenly changed this nationality. And I wanted to play if that poem would work if I changed that country, China. And I used it in the book many times just to kind of to see, you know, if it works, because the political ambition of China now is so much like a political ambition in the US, you know, in the 50s or in the 40s. And I think there's so much similarity between China-American political ambition and economic ambition, not history, of course. So in a way, it's like my communication, you know, through this book to America. You know, American as inspiration, but American also as a kind of, you know, devil land where you come from. You know, it's a complex place.
Yeah. Okay, and then you've talked about this idea of rising beyond and above ideology, and that life is much more than that. And previously, in the interview in Time Out, you were discussing that it was more of a conclusion that emerged rather than that being a focal point that you were writing towards. And I'm wondering if you could give a bit more about that.
I think. You know, I think my attitude is clear with literature and cinema. You know, I am not an old-fashioned writer. I'm not an old-fashioned person. That's clear. But that's not enough. You know, I don't want to live as a professional writer. I want to live as a public intellectual, and that's clear. So my role is to write novels and make films, to bring the discussion about literature, about art, actually, eventually about politics and human life. So, in a way, you know, that kind of life, which means I'm making lots of enemies in my life, because I don't like reading very much of very traditional narrative. You know, my grandmother came in, and my grandmother died, and then my baby was born. You know, that kind of writer I respect. You know, but it's not the foremost thing or the first thing I will read and discuss, because I don't have an appetite to consume another nice little story in my life. But I have a big appetite to discuss the ideas and politics, human visions, or the philosophy behind human, or the life beyond humanity, you know, the space and time beyond this human space. So I have this big appetite about that, which means I would really want to cook those ideas in a narrative format. And the novel, in a way, is a commercial product. You know, I mean, in China we call it 小说, little talk, little trivial talk. But novel in the West is such a big deal, which I detest. So each time I try to write a novel, a bit real, a bit essay-like, you know, a bit intellectual, which is quite repulsive in England. But anyway, I do that because a novel, really, you know, if you know Chinese, it's 小说, it's a little trivial talk. It's for you, you know, after the dinner or pork, you know, you have a little, you know, wine or beer, you know, consume a little story. The real stuff is legend, it's history, it's a poetry, you know. Oh, James Joyce, you know, he wasn't writing a novel. Or Proust, he wasn't writing a novel, but we call that a novel, and it's a repulsive idea. You know? So literature could be end of the novel, but literature could be the beginning of something else. You know, could be poetry, anything, or oral history. You know, but so I wanted to challenge the format of a novel, and I found it deadly commercial. You know, you have to opening, there's characters, and then the progress of the stories. You know, in the end of the novel, you need to be less so dark and depressive, you know, giving some hope and love, you know. All this I challenge, and but by saying that, you have to cook those elements in a way to cheat the readers, and to bring them into this land which you are much more ambitious than the appearance of the book. And I think this is my position, you know. So I am very clear with my position, and I challenge the very old-fashioned way of reading and the old-fashioned way of telling the story. I found a bit unbearable sometimes.
I'm just looking at the time, and I feel like we're just getting started, but I also want to make sure that everyone in the audience has a chance to ask questions. So I'm going to open it up. I know already, we have about an hour, so please in the front.
So I'm wondering if there are any writers in China right now who inspire you, or who you especially like reading.
Yeah.
And also whether, if you were growing up in China now, whether you think you would feel as alienated as you did when you left, whether things have changed enough, or have they changed in a way where you think you might feel even more alienated?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, as outsider, we were discussing about outside, you know, I think any good writer or someone has very sensitive soul, you would always feel outsider. And I think I was lonely in Beijing, and let alone when I was in the southern province, because I was very odd kid. Doesn't get on with anyone, and you know, really in love with poetry and cinema. But I came from a village, so I was really amongst the illiterate culture, you know, very feudal culture. So I felt very lonely actually when, you know, the 30 years lived in China, and that loneliness is very different texture from the loneliness I lived in Europe. It's something else, but it's you know, I will always return to existentialism. We are bound to be lonely if you are sensitive soul, if you're creative, because you don't like to be just pure conformist. Although being conform to certain society is also a very noble thing, because you make a living, you try to find as a human destiny, you know, through conform. But I just couldn't, and I think it suits me in a way, you know, live like bohemian, and I see myself could live in, say, easily, you know, Vancouver or Toronto, a few years, or New York or Boston or LA, you know, a few years. I don't know my final destination, you know. I think you get tired when you get old and you say, well, that's my home. I'm gonna belong to here, you know. So that's my character. I never feel home anywhere. And I think that's why, you know, I think my book have this kind of very strong longing to find a spiritual home through love, you know. But when you ask about the influence, of course, you know, when I was young, you read, you know, much more Chinese literature, you know. But I was never a fan with Chinese classics, you know. I always found it very boring and very heavy-handed, you know. You know, all this stuff, you know, Hong Lou Meng, San Guo Yan, you know, all the traditional Chinese stuff, I found it heavy. And I was very into very kind of, I wouldn't say revolution language, but very kind of simple, dynamic, short sentence. So, you know, I could have, you know, I could have read Miles Little Red Book as entertaining, because I found it very amusing and very poetic. Or I read Margaret Duras, you know, I found it really great, smart. But you know, contemporary writers, of course, when I was younger, you know, I was reading Su Tong, Ma Jian, and Zhu Wen, especially Zhu Wen, I always love, and also Zhu Wen make films. So in a way, because I don't like very professional life, which means I don't really read a writer's writing, which is so seamless. It's so seamless, you're dead, you are dying in their narrative. You couldn't find an exit, and you couldn't find a breath through their narrative. So I always read the books, you know, a bit kind of crooked, say Boris Vian, you know, L'Écume de Joux. And I really love the L'Écume de Joux because it's like a bit, you know, 4 characters going everywhere. And for example, one of my favorite book actually is Sartre's La Noscie, The Noscie. And it's a novel that has no story, but but the contemplation is so strong, and it's doubt throughout each sentence. The doubt about human existence and identity is so strong that for me is so crucial to read a book like this. So my favorite books are, non-standard literature work, and of course, I read a lot of film books. Like if I read Xiaolu Guo's film script, I feel much more inspired than reading, say, some Victorian literature. I'm sorry to say, but so it's really my personality and taste, because I'm very impatient with narrative, and I'm super sensitive with structure, with language, with ideas. There's lots of young Chinese writers, and I often read some internet, Chinese writing. I quite like it. Some are quite superficial and very naive, but this kind of instance, the immediacy, I really like. And because of course I'm very into Beat generation, so I kind of believe there shouldn't be a shadow and a long pause between your mind and your page. So often, maybe with French literature or German literature, there's a long pause and a gap between your mind and your writing. On the page, there's a certain time in between. But I love that kind of writing too. But I'm more like an immediate writer, and therefore all my films look very documentary, although they're all fictionalized film. And I've been called documentary filmmaker, but all my films, has actors in it. Because I think this immediacy is something really original and genuine, especially we're swamped by the Hollywood filmmaking and the Hollywood narrative. So the originality is actually on the very raw thing, like a raw table, raw stuff, and they are the rich things. And I wanted to use that in my writing, in my film.
Well, first of all, I want to agree with your statement that it was an unenjoyable book, because it was very, very enjoyable. And I wanted to know more about the character Iona, the translator, who's obviously so central because she's the bridge between you and the reader and the characters almost amongst themselves. And how did you dream her to life, and how did she become the embodiment really of
I just kind of worry maybe lots of people hasn't read the book, but but okay, there's an English British woman, young woman in the book who is really the central character called Iona, and she's from Scotland, little island. Actually, there's a famous island in Scotland called the Isle of Iona. And I visited all the little islands in Scotland. I love them, but that's the only island I never visited. And it became my obsession in this island. Everyone said, what? You visited all the islands in Scotland, but not that one. But that's the only one you should visit. It's called the Isle of Iona, and there's like hundreds of little church. But it's like a mythical land in the middle of the water. And I think that became my obsession in the last 10 years. Like, God, I never visited that island, And then I made up my mind, I would have a little woman from that island. Her name is Iona. But she will be from another island called the Isle of Mo, which I went. Very beautiful but sad, lonely island in Scotland. And the people are really genuine, they drink a lot, they're all a bit fucked up. And so I made sure that she came from a very fucked up island. And she always longing for the island opposite, because if you're standing on the island of Mo, you would see island of Iona in front of you, but you can't cross, there's quite a waterway. And so I made sure this character was born there, so that's like a poetic identity of my British woman character. And I think, for that I had to research, because I really don't know how, an Irish, Scottish woman live. But then essentially the same, they drink milky tea, I drink non-milky tea. So it's quite similar. And her sexuality, I think my sexuality is very conformist, and I think I want to exercise all the freedom with her, so she has a very busy sexual life, which I don't have. And she is very apolitical. And I think I met lots of English young women very apolitical. I think I still would say England is a relatively very free society, if you come from China. And even compared with other European countries, I think England is still quite tolerant country, because I think the tradition of the colony, and I think they're aware of other opinions exist. So I made her very free and apolitical, which is a big contrast of those two Chinese lovers, totally political, and from this monophone culture, which is called the Chinese culture. So really kind of longing to create this character which is against me all the time, question my way of existence and my character's existence. So this is Iona. But also my dream is like, I want to write a character who lives between the culture, you know, who is not Chinese, not British, who's from little island, you know, and who's been outsider, you know, who plays his cultural roles, you know. I think it's amazing lots of people speak more than 2 languages, and I think those people are amazing, because if someone only speaks 1 language, and that's a problematic situation, the world is changed. So you couldn't really understand in other language or other mentality, and that's very, you know, it's a very fascist way of living, you know, you only maintain your language and then you die, you know. I mean, some European country, you know, has this attitude like, you know, fuck off, that's your language, that's your culture, I'm going to preserve my culture. And I don't find that's actually positive. So I think the healthy way is actually you should learn other culture, you should speak other language in order to even preserve your own language and the culture, you know, that's a healthy way to do. So I wanted to write these characters who knows all the language and who translates. So she is the cultural interpret readings, because actually you are reading detective novel, and you're reading through this translator. And I get her to mistranslate some stuff, because I think it's important. We live in a mistranslation, a misinterpretation, and especially a political mistranslation, you know, interpretation is very important. How do you misread, you know, George W. Bush, or how do you misread the Chinese president? You know, this is very important. Political game in a way, you know. And I was like, why don't we play with this game, with narrative? You know, it's a big deal. So then you discover there's one plot, which is the translator discover the truth from different way of translating a tense, a sentence from a little diary. And I think that's really important to exercise as a writer who you know, I write in both languages. So I think that's something very important to suggest in a narrative. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Please, young people?
Yes,
Yeah. I just realized I'm being filmed. And I swear them 5 times.
Why is there a quote at the beginning of every part of the book?
The quote of the, which one? The I'm China?
Yes.
Where does this quote come from?
At the beginning of each chapter.
Oh yeah, the quote at the beginning of each chapter. Yeah, well, yeah. Okay, well, you know, this is a format, you know. But I would just say, you know, in the very beginning of the book, I found this poem from W.H. Auden, and I loved it so much, and I think those poems are my real inspiration of writing novels. And so I managed to put there in the beginning of the book, you know, this poem, this is very short, 4 lines from Auden. It's from his poem called As I Walked Out One Evening. And the sentence goes like this: I will love you, dear, I will love you, till China and Africa meet, and till the river jumps over the mountain, and the salmon sing in the street. Because I thought, you know, the idea of China and Africa is so remote from each other, and you know, our culture actually is much more different than Chinese culture to the European culture or the Western culture. So I think this is the distance, you know, we have between the East and the West, with China and Africa. I mean, so this is one of the quotes I put, but the rest of the quote, I wanted to use very old Chinese, you know, verse or idiomatic expression to begin a chapter, because I think some Zen stories, amazing, you know, and I mean, really interesting. The little Buddhist story and the Zen story, I think they say the truth in the most minimal sentence, in the most minimal way. So for a novel, when you don't want to direct or suggest some message, there's always a way, just use quote. And those, you know, the Asian, the Chinese quote. For example, there's one idiom, the Chinese called 东张西望, to look east, to look the west. And this is such a simple expression, 东张西望, look east, look west. But then I thought, exactly that we need to do, 东张西望, you know. And those things I think we ignored when you speak Chinese or when you study Chinese, and they are really philosophical. And the Chinese language we are using is, is post-Mao language, is after revolution language. So it's much simpler, much more slogan-based, much more socialist vocabulary. But the Chinese before 1949 is different type of Chinese, in Eileen Chang's work, in Lu Xin's work. And I think it's very complex, what kind of Chinese language you use. It's also an identity, a choice. So there's no simple one Chinese language in a way, yeah.
All right, anything else? Oh, move over there.
I was wondering, when you write in Chinese, I don't know whereabouts in the south you come from, but whether or not it feels as much of a struggle to write how you feel if it's not that similar to
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. It's good language. It's good question about language. I'm always very interested in talk about language and identity, but not in the superficial way. Say, I wouldn't say, okay, I say something like that for years. I say, well, of course, writing English is difficult, yeah, but that's not the point. The point is how do you reinvent another identity when you write in different language? So like the French philosopher Roland Barthes said, the language is a skin, and we only wear one layer of skin against the other, or against society. For Roland Barthes, that's a skin you communicate with the other. But sorry, Mr. Barthes, you as an old French, you use one language to communicate and to write, and that's imperialistic. And what if people speak 3 languages and they're writing 2 or 3 languages like me? And there's many writers nowadays writing in different languages. It's amazing, and they create different identities. What if people play with different identities? And I think that's a crucial question we ask a writer and a literature world. There's not one comfortable position for you to hold on, dear old Mr. Master. No. And I challenge that position because I write in Chinese and I realize I write really differently nowadays. I do write Chinese essays while I finish an English novel, just to find back some kind of structure or culture. And when I write in Chinese, I don't find it creative nowadays because I write with my old habit. I don't really reinvent the Chinese sentence like I reinvent English sentence. And the English sentence are a bit unusual, very short, and playing with ideas and linguistic ideas. So I don't find that I'm super creative when I'm writing in Chinese characters or a Chinese story. But with English format, I play lots of stuff, cultural symbols, and I change tense, and I even put the character living in the linguistic dilemma. And also I exercise. So when you write in English, I automatically become a modernist or post-structuralist. I have the narrative from Z to A rather than from A to Z, because you lost the comfortable cultural reference. So you have to just find a way to organize your character, which are mainly live in the West or have multinationalities. But when I write in Chinese, they will be the Chinese peasants I know. I lived in a peasant place for 20 years. And they will speak one language, one type of language, which is Zhejiang dialect, which I'm going to show a film tomorrow noon when I'm doing the film masterclass. And I think that's something, I have been living that comfortable cultural reference for so long that I no longer create the new type of narrative or new type of language. So this is really interesting, and I think very important for a writer to try. You live outside of your culture. And again, because I came from South, which is between Zhejiang and Fujian, a little fishing island. So my grandparents, they speak Minnan Hua, Fujian Hua. And I spoke Zhejiang dialect to my parents. And then I left my hometown when I was 20. I went to Beijing to study film. When I was 20, I spoke Mandarin. So then I learned to write Chinese in a more formal northern language, which my southern dialect is informal, is more little material-based, more like lively, but even trivial. Sometimes the language has different characters. And I think that is different language too. Although there's one writing system in China, but that has totally different style and culture, from each dialect. And I think, so I remember when I was in Beijing, I was writing the columns for Shuchang. It's a very important literature magazine. And I wrote this one essay called Me as a Writer Lost My Home Language. and I write in second language. So that was 20 years ago. When I was living in China, I said I lost my home language to write. And what I meant is I no longer use a language where I grew up to write. You know, I adopt the Beijingese language, which is much more male language, which is a much more Maoist language, because that's how the capital built on this Wangshuo Beijingese language. And that's not my language. So so that's my question to lots of writers, like, what, you think you're writing in German? You sure? You sure you're not writing in Danish? Because I wanted to question this non-questioned zone, you know, where we come from, and where our culture is so being reconstructed from recent history or from remote history. And I don't like that comfortable self-comfort place, you know. And I guess, of course, that's because of my background, you know. And I realize we are just purely construction. Indeed, a philosophical construction, you know. We are narrative, purely narrative. Yeah.
To stay with the language problem, in China, Mu and Tian's letters and diaries are supposed to be written in Chinese and then translated by Ariona into English.
Yeah.
Did you write them? Did you think about those letters first in Chinese and then translated them into English? Or did you think about those letters directly?
What an amazing question. So now I can say this, yeah. When you think it's not a verbal written language, when you think it's a psycho language, I can nearly be sure about this. So if you read Noam Chomsky or Steven Pinker, you know, those linguists in America, they know, you know, the psycho language is not verbal based. For example, I did an experiment, because I live in between languages and writing so many books in different languages. I really was obsessed with what kind of psycho language you use, and then what kind of written language you're going to manifest, because I speak French too. So I know this, there's a very big distance between your psycho language and the verbal language. Now, the exercise is, you had a dream, you know, everyone has a dream. So your grandmother was speaking some language to your French boyfriend or your English girlfriend with a language everyone understands, but your grandmother's native, some Chinese from village, you know. So in the dream, everyone speaks, but they are from totally different language background, and they all understand each other. You know, you try to write down those kind of dreams, and you will ask yourself, why in a dream they don't need a translator? Now, so this exercise, this experiment is very important. It revealed we think and dream in a psycho language which is not verbalized, not through certain letters at all. And that is unique, the thought language. Now I start to read lots of books about psychology and this kind of language here, but not this linguistic level. So now, there's a transformation from psyche language, the thought language, to here, which goes through the visualization of your thought language to a literary, no, not even literary language, it's verbal language. And there's a point, now you decide you write in Chinese or English. And first you have to visualize those thoughts into the letters. And that is totally mad process in your brain. The hormone goes crazy, you know. Because that is so amazing, you know, scientific speaking, your brain goes through this really interesting construction. You know, it's not automatic, everything. But it was automatic now, how many 60,000 years of the evolution. So when the words land on this page, you know, that is a problem. I thought, oh, so they would be speaking Chinese to each other, but there's an English woman here, analyze those letters. And then I will be the decision maker to put down those thoughts in English. But as you read the book, you know, there's Chinese text in and out. And I remember in my manuscript, there's a lot of Chinese writing, lots of Chinese letters. In each draft, they've been deleted because it was like, well, you know, that looked like a beautiful graphic in the English novel, you know. So now they're like, you know, less and less so. And I remember when I delivered to Random House, the first draft was half-half. You know, whenever there's a letter or a diary, that would be Chinese. There's a paragraph of Chinese. Because I wanted Chinese readers to be able to read and guess what's English about from reading Chinese. But now you see there's very little Chinese writing in it. Which is a shame. I mean, in the future I would do stuff like that more, you know. And again, now as commodity, you know, they would just make it simple, you know, okay, don't do so much exercise, please, you know.
Thank you.
Please, yeah.
I'm asking you because you're a writer.
Oh, I can't hear.
When you go to a bookstore to read a book, how do you go decide what book to read with all the amounts of books
Yeah,
that
that's
are out
right.
there?
Yeah. Yeah, the bookstore. Well, I'm not a very good person to answer this question because I'm a very mean reader. So the kind of readers are the university teachers, the book festival organizer, your teachers here, you are kind of reader because your job is promote culture, to educate others, But my job is to find my own voice, to find my own original identity as a writer. So I'm extremely critical and picky. So often I find, a very kind of conventional novel, my grandmother come tell me this, and I said, yeah, fine. And then I read the middle part, it's still that narrative format. Then I get really bored quickly. And that's very judgmental, brutal way to judge a book. But life is very short, and I make 10 films too. So for me, it's a smell, I think it's a smell of the book, when I look at the book, they're so fragmented, and they're so naughty, and they're so full of flaws, the problems. And I'll be very sensitive to that writer, and I read a bit, and then I said, God, that's amazing, because there's some sentence that sparks out. It's really spark out for its own unique identity. For example, this the New York writer who wrote Open City, a Nigerian writer, I think he's great, and I can't remember his name. And recently I read another book called The Department of Speculation by another kind of New York woman writer. And those writers are not very well known, but they write as artists. They don't write as a craftsman or wordsmith. So I think you will be a much kinder reader than me. And also my reading list is very, old-fashioned. So, for example, because my taste is more like 1950s, 60s Europe and the US. So I return to those writers I like, Jean Genet or kind of there's certain Italian writers I really attached to, and Spanish writers, Latin American writers. So because I read those writers when I was in China, so I was eager to find out them in English or in English translation. So I will read them again and again in English. So my knowledge is kind of is selected, mean kind of selection for my to construct myself. But again, also I say one example, the Portuguese writer Fernando Pessoa, and he's one of my favorite writers who wrote the Book of Disquiet. And I think I want to find those writers who has similar identity and problem as I have. If you are a writer, you are more or less very troubled person, because you only write when there's deep problem in you. Otherwise, you write quite superficially. And I think we're all mentally quite sick and problematic, and we try to sort out those questions in a narrative format or in a philosophical book. So I'm attracted to those writers who, insane, I mean, most of the writers I read, and then in the end of the page I discovered, oh shit, this writer probably committed suicide. And they were. And I think that was also another element. I scared myself because of my taste and the kind of the way of my life is so, it's always kind of, the blade against the wrist, that kind of feeling, so it's always on the edge. And you often identify those writers. For example, one of my favorite writers, Italo Calvino, or not, actually, I wouldn't say Calvino, I would say Pasolini, because he's also a filmmaker. And I think when I read Pasolini's poetry, I felt this pain against my wrist, because he's absolutely confrontational, absolutely provocative in a totally genuine way. And I really identify with that attitude. So, and I think you try to find your comradeship through the reading.
Great. Okay, we're a bit over time. So thank you very much, Xiaolu. And she has a masterclass on film that she's doing tomorrow afternoon. So make sure to stop by for that. And also, if you haven't read I Am China, you definitely should, because it will. You'll want to rip through it in a day, which is what I did, because you can't put it down. So it's definitely great. And thank you very much for coming out.